On the evening of February 18, 2001, a 56-year-old FBI agent named Robert Philip Hanssen placed a package containing classified documents under a footbridge in Foxstone Park in Vienna, Virginia, approximately 8 miles from FBI headquarters. The drop site, which Hanssen had codenamed Ellis, was one of more than a dozen locations he had used over the previous 2 decades to deliver American intelligence secrets to the Soviet Union and later to Russia. The walk from his car to the bridge took approximately 3 minutes. What Hanssen did not know was that more than 100 FBI agents and surveillance specialists were watching him from concealed positions throughout the park. He had made this walk dozens of times before without detection. This time would be different. Within minutes of placing the package, Hanssen was surrounded by armed federal agents, ordered to his knees, handcuffed, and placed under arrest. The investigation that led to that moment had consumed the FBI for years, had cost millions of dollars, and had required the cooperation of a former KGB officer who sold Hanssen's file to American intelligence for $7 million. And even then, even with documentary evidence and surveillance and the testimony of Russian sources, the FBI had struggled to believe that one of their own, a man who had worked in counterintelligence for more than 20 years, could have been selling secrets since 1979. Robert Philip Hanssen was born in Chicago, Illinois, in April 1944. The only child of Howard Hanssen, a police officer with the Chicago Police Department, and Vivian Hanssen, a homemaker. Howard Hanssen was, by all accounts, a difficult man, demanding and often cruel, particularly toward his son. He had high expectations that Robert rarely met to his satisfaction, and their relationship was characterized by tension and emotional distance that would persist throughout Howard's life. Robert was intelligent, socially awkward, and intensely private. He attended local Catholic schools, where he excelled academically but struggled to form friendships. Teachers described him as brilliant but odd, capable of extraordinary focus on subjects that interested him, indifferent or hostile to subjects that did not. He graduated from William Howard Taft High School in 1962 and enrolled at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, where he majored in chemistry. At Knox, Hanssen remained socially isolated, spending most of his time studying or reading in his dormitory room. He graduated in 1966 with honors and immediately enrolled in a dental program at Northwestern University. He lasted 1 year before dropping out, later explaining that he found the work tedious and the prospect of a career in dentistry unbearable. In 1967, he enrolled in the business school at Northwestern, pursuing an MBA with a focus on accounting and information systems. It was during his time at Northwestern that Hanssen met Bonnie Wauck, a young woman from a devout Catholic family who was teaching at a local school. Bonnie was intelligent, deeply religious, and came from a large, close-knit family that stood in stark contrast to Hanssen's own isolated upbringing. They began dating in 1967, and Bonnie introduced Robert to a social world he had never experienced. Family dinners, church activities, conversations about faith and morality. Hanssen, who had been raised Lutheran but had little religious conviction, began attending Catholic Mass with Bonnie and eventually converted to Catholicism. They married in 1968, shortly before Hanssen completed his MBA. After graduation in 1970, Hanssen took a position as an accountant with a firm in Chicago, work that paid well but bored him profoundly. He lasted 3 years before applying to the Chicago Police Department, following in his father's footsteps in a decision that seemed to surprise everyone who knew him, including Bonnie. He was accepted and assigned to the department's Internal Affairs Division, investigating corruption and misconduct among police officers. The work required discretion, attention to detail, and the ability to operate in an environment of suspicion and secrecy, skills that Hanssen possessed in abundance. In 1976, after 3 years with the Chicago Police Department, Hanssen applied to the FBI. He was accepted, underwent training at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, and received his first assignment to the Gary, Indiana field office, working on white-collar crime and organized crime cases. The work was investigative rather than operational, suited to Hanssen's analytical mind and his preference for working alone. In 1978, Hanssen was transferred to the FBI's New York field office, where he was assigned to the Soviet Analytical Unit, a section responsible for tracking Soviet intelligence activities in the United States. The transfer to New York came at a difficult time in Hanssen's personal life. He and Bonnie had 6 children by 1978, living on an FBI salary that was sufficient for basic needs, but strained by the costs of raising a large family in one of the most expensive cities in the country. Bonnie had stopped working to care for the children, and Hanssen, who handled the family finances, found himself perpetually anxious about money. He took a second job doing accounting work in the evenings, but the additional income barely covered the growing expenses. The stress of financial pressure, combined with the demands of his FBI work and the responsibilities of a large family, created a background tension that colored every aspect of Hanssen's life. It was in this context, in October 1979, that Robert Hanssen made his first approach to Soviet intelligence. The decision was not dramatic or born from ideological conviction. It emerged from a calculation that Hanssen had been making for months. He had access to extraordinarily valuable information that the Soviets would pay significant amounts of money to obtain, and he believed, with the confidence of someone who understood security systems from the inside, that he could provide that information without being detected. Hanssen's approach was methodical. He did not walk into the Soviet embassy or make contact with known intelligence officers, moves that he knew would be detected by FBI surveillance. Instead, he sent an anonymous letter to a Soviet military intelligence officer whose name he had identified through his work in the Soviet Analytical Unit. The letter, which Hanssen typed on an untraceable typewriter, offered to provide classified information in exchange for cash. It included a sample document to demonstrate his access and proposed a system of dead drops for future exchanges. The letter was signed B, a pseudonym Hanssen would use throughout his espionage career. The Soviets, recognizing the value of the offer, responded with professional interest. They established protocols for communication, designated dead drop locations, and arranged for payment. And in November 1979, Robert Hanssen made his first delivery of classified FBI documents to Soviet military intelligence, the GRU. The package contained information about FBI counterintelligence operations, surveillance techniques, and the identities of Soviet officials under investigation. In exchange, the Soviets left $20,000 in cash at a dead drop site in a park in New York. For the next 18 months, Hanssen continued to provide classified information to the GRU. He operated with extreme caution, never meeting his handlers face-to-face, never using his real name, never deviating from the strict protocols he had established. The money accumulated in cash that Hanssen hid in various locations, some of which he would later forget. He did not spend the money lavishly or make purchases that would draw attention. Instead, he used it to cover expenses, to reduce the constant financial pressure that had driven him to espionage in the first place. In 1980, Bonnie Hanssen made a discovery that should have ended her husband's espionage career before it could cause lasting damage. While cleaning their bedroom, she found a large amount of cash hidden in a drawer. Cash that could not be explained by Robert's FBI salary or his evening accounting work. When confronted, Hanssen initially attempted to deflect, but Bonnie pressed, and eventually, he confessed. He told her that he had been providing information to the Soviets in exchange for money. He claimed that the information was not particularly sensitive, that he had been careful not to compromise operations or endanger lives, and that he had done it only because they needed the money. Bonnie Hanssen was devastated. She insisted that Robert confess to a priest, seek guidance, and stop immediately. Robert agreed. They met with their parish priest, Father Robert Bucciarelli, and Robert confessed what he had done. The priest, bound by the seal of confession but deeply troubled by what he had heard, advised Robert to stop the espionage, to return the money if possible, and to seek forgiveness through prayer and penance. Critically, Father Bucciarelli did not advise either of them to report Robert's actions to the FBI, a decision that would later be the subject of intense scrutiny and debate. Robert Hanssen told his wife that he would stop. He told the priest that he would stop. And for approximately 5 years, he did stop. He severed contact with the GRU, made no further approaches to Soviet intelligence, and returned to the work of being an FBI agent and a father. The money he had received remained hidden. Some of it eventually donated to Mother Teresa's charity, a gesture that Hanssen framed as penance but which did nothing to undo the damage he had already caused. In 1981, Hanssen was transferred back to Washington, D.C., where he was assigned to the FBI's Soviet Analytical Unit at headquarters. The work gave him access to some of the most sensitive counterintelligence information in the American intelligence community, including details of FBI and CIA operations against Soviet intelligence. He was promoted, received positive performance evaluations, and was regarded by colleagues as competent if socially awkward, a man who kept to himself but performed his duties with precision. For 4 years, Hanssen did not engage in espionage. But the financial pressures that had driven him to betray his country in 1979 did not disappear. He and Bonnie continued to raise 6 children on an FBI salary. The expenses of Catholic school tuition, mortgage payments, and the costs of a large family continued to accumulate. And Hanssen, who had experienced the financial relief that espionage money had provided, began to consider resuming his relationship with Soviet intelligence. In October 1985, the same month that Aldrich Ames walked into the Soviet embassy with his first package of CIA secrets, Robert Hanssen sent a letter to the KGB Residentura at the Soviet embassy in Washington. The letter was more sophisticated than his first approach in 1979, reflecting Hanssen's increased understanding of intelligence operations and security protocols. He did not use his name. He did not provide any information that could be used to identify him. The letter was typed, untraceable, and addressed to a specific KGB officer whose name Hanssen had learned through his work at the FBI. The letter offered to provide information about American intelligence operations in exchange for money. It included, as a demonstration of his access, a package containing the names of 3 Soviet intelligence officers who were working for the FBI and the CIA. The KGB, recognizing the extraordinary value of this offer, responded immediately. They established communication protocols, designated dead-drop sites, and began what would become one of the longest and most damaging penetrations in the history of American intelligence. Unlike his earlier relationship with the GRU, Hanssen's work with the KGB would continue for more than 15 years, surviving the collapse of the Soviet Union and continuing with Russian intelligence services into the 21st century. The first package Hanssen delivered to the KGB in October 1985 contained devastating information. He identified 3 Soviet officials working for American intelligence: Sergei Motorin, Valery Martinov, and Boris Yuzhin. The first 2 names were also provided to the Soviets by Aldrich Ames, creating a redundancy that would later complicate efforts to identify the source of the compromise. Boris Yuzhin, however, was uniquely compromised by Hanssen. All 3 men were recalled to Moscow, arrested, interrogated, and convicted of treason. Motorin and Martinov were executed in 1987. Yuzhin received a lengthy prison sentence and survived to be released after the collapse of the Soviet Union, though his life had been irrevocably destroyed. Over the following months, Hanssen provided the KGB with comprehensive details about American intelligence operations. He disclosed the existence of a tunnel the FBI had dug beneath the Soviet embassy in Washington to intercept communications. He revealed FBI surveillance techniques, recruitment operations, and the identities of Soviet officials under investigation. He provided technical details about American intelligence gathering capabilities, including information about satellite reconnaissance and signals intelligence. And in return, the KGB paid him in cash and diamonds, eventually totaling more than $1.4 million over the course of his espionage career. Hanssen's operational security was extraordinary, particularly for someone operating from within the organization tasked with catching spies. He never met his handlers face to face. He never used his real name in communications. He never made the kinds of obvious mistakes that had led to the exposure of other spies, sudden wealth, unexplained foreign travel, changes in behavior that might attract attention. He continued to live modestly, to drive an aging car, to maintain the appearance of a civil servant struggling to support a large family on a government salary. The money he received from the Russians was hidden in various locations, some in his house, some in other places he visited regularly. He spent some of it on expenses, some on gifts for Bonnie that could be explained as careful savings, and some he simply accumulated, hidden away against an uncertain future. The damage Hanssen caused during this period was catastrophic, though its full extent would not be understood for years. Beyond the three sources he compromised in his first delivery, Hanssen would eventually betray additional FBI and CIA operations. He disclosed the identities of intelligence sources whose information had been critical to understanding Soviet military capabilities and political intentions. He compromised technical operations that had cost millions of dollars and years of planning. And critically, he provided the KGB and later the SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, with detailed information about how American counterintelligence worked, allowing them to train their officers to evade FBI surveillance and detection. What distinguished Hanssen from other spies, including Aldrich Ames, was the duration of his betrayal and the sophistication of his operational security. While Ames had operated for 9 years before being caught, Hanssen would operate for more than 20 years in total, with a 5-year interruption between 1980 and 1985. While Ames had made obvious mistakes, purchasing expensive houses and cars that far exceeded his salary, Hanssen maintained such strict financial discipline that he aroused no suspicion despite receiving more than $1 million from the Russians. The FBI's counterintelligence division understood by the late 1980s that they faced a catastrophic penetration. The collapse of operations, the arrest and execution of sources, the apparent Soviet knowledge of FBI capabilities all pointed to a mole. But identifying the source proved extraordinarily difficult. The FBI conducted internal investigations, reviewed personnel files, examined financial records, and interviewed hundreds of employees. They established a joint task force with the CIA to investigate the compromises, the same task force that would eventually identify Aldrich Ames as the source of CIA losses. But the FBI's own mole remained undetected. Part of the difficulty lay in the overlapping compromises caused by Ames and Hanssen operating simultaneously. When Motorin and Martinov were arrested and executed, the FBI initially assumed that Ames, whose espionage was discovered in 1994, had been solely responsible. The connection between Ames and those specific compromises seemed to explain the losses, and the investigation focused on ensuring that all of Ames's damage was documented, rather than considering the possibility of an additional mole. But after Ames's arrest, new compromises continued. Operations that Ames had no access to were mysteriously blown. Russian intelligence demonstrated knowledge of FBI activities that could not be explained by Ames's betrayal. By the mid-1990s, the FBI understood that they still had a mole, but they had no clear suspect, no obvious lead, and a list of potential candidates that included hundreds of employees who had access to the compromised information. The investigation, codenamed Gray Suit, consumed enormous resources. FBI investigators reviewed thousands of files, conducted interviews, monitored communications, and analyzed operational failures to try to identify patterns that might point to a specific individual. They developed profiles of what the mole might look like. Someone with access to sensitive counterintelligence information, someone who had been with the FBI for many years, someone whose behavior suggested no obvious red flags. The profile described dozens of potential suspects, and Robert Hanssen was among them. But so were many others. Hanssen, meanwhile, continued his espionage with systematic efficiency. He was promoted within the FBI, moving through various positions that gave him access to different types of classified information. In 1995, he was assigned to the FBI's Office of Foreign Missions, a position that allowed him to monitor Russian diplomatic personnel in the United States. The irony of a Russian spy working in a unit responsible for countering Russian intelligence was apparently lost on the FBI administrators who made the assignment. Throughout this period, Hanssen maintained his cover as a devoted Catholic, a faithful husband, and a dedicated father. He attended Mass regularly with Bonnie and their children. He participated in church activities, donated money to religious charities, and presented himself as a man of faith and principle. The contradiction between his public persona and his secret activities created a cognitive dissonance that Hanssen apparently managed through a process of compartmentalization, separating his espionage work from his religious and family life in ways that allowed him to function in both without apparent psychological crisis. But Hanssen's personal life was more complicated than it appeared. In the early 1990s, he began a relationship with a stripper in Washington, D.C., a woman named Priscilla Sue Gailey, to whom he gave gifts, money, and access to his thoughts and fantasies in ways that he never shared with Bonnie. The relationship was not sexual, according to later testimony, but it was emotionally intimate, and it represented a form of betrayal that Hanssen seemed to compartmentalize separately from his espionage. He also, according to evidence later discovered, secretly videotaped himself and Bonnie engaged in intimate activities and shared those tapes with a friend, another form of betrayal that suggested deep dysfunction beneath Hanssen's carefully controlled exterior. The breakthrough in the FBI's investigation came not from internal detective work but from an external source. In late 2000, a former KGB officer approached American intelligence with an offer to sell a file that he claimed would identify the FBI mole. The price was $7 million, an extraordinary sum that reflected the file's apparent value. The CIA, working with the FBI, agreed to the purchase. The file, when delivered, contained documentation of communications between the KGB and a source identified only by the codename Ramon Garcia, later changed to B. The file included copies of letters Hanssen had sent to his handlers, records of payments, and most critically, a tape recording of a conversation in which the source's voice had been captured. The letters in the file were analyzed by FBI investigators, who noted details that allowed them to narrow the list of suspects considerably. The author clearly had access to high-level counterintelligence information. The author had been with the FBI since at least the early 1980s. The author demonstrated knowledge of specific operations and technical capabilities that only a limited number of FBI employees would have known about. And critically, the voice on the tape recording could be compared to voice samples from potential suspects. By late 2000, the FBI had narrowed the list of suspects to a small group of individuals, and Robert Hanssen was among them. But the evidence was still circumstantial, and the FBI needed more than a voice comparison and access patterns to make an arrest. They needed to catch Hanssen in the act of espionage, to document his activities in ways that would be admissible in court and would justify the charges they intended to bring. In December 2000, the FBI made the decision to reassign Hanssen to a newly created position at FBI headquarters, a position that was entirely fabricated to allow continuous surveillance. Hanssen was told that he was being brought in to work on a special classified project, a role that he accepted without apparent suspicion. The position allowed FBI investigators to monitor Hanssen's movements, his computer usage, his communications, and his activities both at work and outside of work. On January 12, 2001, FBI agents secretly searched Hanssen's car while he was at work and discovered a package containing classified documents in the trunk, documents that were clearly being prepared for delivery to Russian intelligence. The evidence was compelling, but the FBI wanted more. They wanted to catch Hanssen making an actual drop, to document the full extent of his espionage activities, and to ensure that the case against him would be overwhelming. The surveillance that followed was extensive. FBI agents monitored Hanssen continuously, tracking his movements, recording his activities, and waiting for him to make contact with his Russian handlers. They installed cameras in Foxstone Park, the location they believed Hanssen was using for dead drops based on analysis of the documents found in his car. They positioned surveillance teams throughout the area, prepared to move in the moment Hanssen made his drop. On February 18, 2001, Robert Hanssen left his house in the early evening, drove to Foxstone Park in Vienna, Virginia, and walked to the footbridge designated as the Ellis drop site. He carried a package containing classified documents. FBI surveillance teams watched as he placed the package under the bridge, marked a signal to indicate that a drop had been made, and began walking back toward his car. When he reached the parking area, more than 100 FBI agents emerged from concealment, surrounded him, ordered him to the ground, and placed him under arrest. Hanssen's reaction, according to agents present, was one of resignation rather than surprise. He did not resist. He did not attempt to flee. When one of the arresting agents asked him a question, Hanssen reportedly replied, "What took you so long?" A statement that suggested he had known that his capture was inevitable, that he had perhaps been waiting for this moment for years. The search of Hanssen's home, his car, and his office yielded extensive evidence. FBI investigators found classified documents hidden in his house. They found packaging materials, trash bags he had used to protect documents during dead drops, maps marked with drop site locations. They found financial records that documented the money he had received from Russian intelligence. And they found computer files containing drafts of letters to his handlers, communications that documented years of espionage activities. Robert Hanssen was charged with 15 counts of espionage and conspiracy to commit espionage. The evidence against him was overwhelming and irrefutable. During interrogations, Hanssen initially attempted to minimize what he had done, suggesting that much of the information he had provided was not particularly sensitive, that he had been careful not to compromise operations that would endanger lives. But as interrogators presented him with the evidence, the documents from his house, the tape recordings, the communications recovered from the Russian file, his position became untenable. Hanssen's attorneys, recognizing that a trial would almost certainly result in conviction and a possible death sentence, began negotiating a plea agreement. Hanssen was willing to cooperate, to provide information about what he had betrayed and how he had operated, in exchange for a guarantee that he would not face execution and that Bonnie would be allowed to keep a portion of his FBI pension. On July 6, 2001, as part of a plea agreement, Robert Hanssen pleaded guilty to 15 counts of espionage. In exchange for his cooperation and full disclosure of his activities, federal prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. Hanssen also agreed to submit to extensive debriefings, to provide investigators with detailed information about what he had betrayed, when, and how. The damage assessment that followed revealed the full scope of Hanssen's betrayal. He had compromised more than 50 intelligence operations. He had identified at least 3 intelligence sources by name, all of whom had been arrested and 2 of whom had been executed. He had disclosed technical surveillance programs, recruitment strategies, and the identities of FBI and CIA officers working on Soviet and Russian operations. He had provided the Russians with detailed information about American intelligence capabilities that had allowed them to train their officers to evade detection and to operate more effectively against the United States. On May 10, 2002, Robert Hanssen was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to ADX Florence, a supermax federal prison in Colorado designed to hold the most dangerous inmates in the federal system. There, he would spend the next 21 years in solitary confinement, isolated from other prisoners, allowed minimal contact with the outside world. The impact of Hanssen's arrest on his family was catastrophic. Bonnie Hanssen, who had discovered her husband's espionage in 1980 and had believed his promise to stop, learned in 2001 that he had resumed his betrayal and had continued it for more than 15 years after his confession. She and their 6 children were suddenly the family of one of the most notorious traitors in American history. The FBI allowed Bonnie to keep a portion of Robert's pension as part of the plea agreement, but the financial security it provided could not compensate for the destruction of their lives. The children, who ranged in age from their late teens to their 30s at the time of their father's arrest, struggled to reconcile the man they had known, a devout Catholic, a demanding but present father, with the man described in news reports and court documents. Some maintained limited contact with Robert in prison, others severed ties entirely. The family's name became synonymous with betrayal, making it difficult for them to move forward with anything resembling normal lives. Bonnie Hanssen gave one interview in 2002 in which she described the devastation of learning that her husband had lied to her for more than 20 years, that his confession in 1980 had been followed not by genuine repentance but by a calculated return to espionage. She expressed anger, betrayal, and profound sadness at the waste of their lives together. She also expressed faith that God would judge Robert appropriately, a statement that reflected her deep religious convictions but provided little apparent comfort. The question of what Robert Hanssen had betrayed and why consumed investigators for years. The damage assessment, conducted by the FBI and CIA with Hanssen's cooperation, identified specific operations that had been compromised, specific sources who had been exposed, and specific technical capabilities that had been disclosed. But the motivations behind Hanssen's betrayal remained more complicated. Unlike some spies who claimed ideological reasons for their treason, Hanssen never articulated a coherent political philosophy that explained his actions. He was not a communist. He did not express sympathy for Soviet or Russian political systems. His betrayal appeared to be motivated primarily by money, by ego, and by a desire for significance that his work at the FBI did not provide. In debriefings, Hanssen suggested that he had enjoyed the intellectual challenge of espionage, the feeling of operating undetected within the system designed to catch people like him. He described his relationship with his Russian handlers as a kind of game, a contest of wits that he believed he was winning. This framing, like Aldrich Ames's comparison of espionage to warfare, has been widely criticized as self-serving rationalization that avoids confronting the human cost of his decisions. The men Hanssen betrayed were not pieces in a game. They were individuals who had made choices to work with American intelligence, who had families and lives that extended beyond their roles as sources, and who died or had their lives destroyed because Robert Hanssen needed money and wanted to feel clever. Sergei Motorin and Valery Martinov, the 2 KGB officers whose names Hanssen provided in his first delivery to the KGB in 1985, were executed in May 1987. Their deaths were also caused by Aldrich Ames's simultaneous betrayal, creating a redundancy that meant both men were doomed regardless of whether either spy had been caught earlier. But Hanssen's betrayal of them was independent and would have been sufficient on its own to cause their executions. Boris Yuzhin, The third name Hanssen provided was uniquely his victim. Yuzhin was a KGB officer working undercover in San Francisco, providing information to the FBI about Soviet intelligence operations. When his name was given to the KGB by Hanssen, Yuzhin was recalled to Moscow under a pretext, arrested upon arrival, interrogated, tried in secret, and sentenced to 15 years in a labor camp. Unlike Motorin and Martinov, Yuzhin survived, primarily because the KGB believed he might have additional intelligence value and because his position had been less sensitive than the others. He was released after the collapse of the Soviet Union, emigrated to the United States, and has spoken publicly about his ordeal, including his anger at Hanssen for destroying his life. In an interview conducted in 2003, Yuzhin described the moment he learned that Robert Hanssen had been the one who betrayed him. He had spent more than a decade wondering who had exposed him, had assumed it was Aldrich Ames along with the others, and had learned only after Hanssen's arrest that there had been a second mole who had independently compromised him. Yuzhin expressed a kind of exhausted resignation, noting that his suffering had been caused by someone who did not know him, had never met him, and had sold his name for cash without apparent thought for what would happen to him or his family. The other sources Hanssen compromised are less well documented, partly because some remain classified and partly because the Russian government has never fully disclosed what happened to them. Declassified damage assessments reference multiple intelligence sources who were arrested, interrogated, and in some cases executed as a direct result of Hanssen's betrayal. Each had a name, a family, and a life that was destroyed because an FBI agent decided that money and the thrill of espionage were worth more than their lives. The impact of Hanssen's betrayal on the FBI as an institution was profound. The agency had built its reputation on its ability to investigate and catch spies, and the revelation that one of its own had operated undetected for more than 20 years represented a fundamental failure of internal security. The FBI conducted extensive reviews of its counterintelligence procedures, its personnel security protocols, and its culture. Changes were implemented: more frequent polygraph examinations, enhanced financial monitoring, stricter access controls, and a reorganization of counterintelligence operations to reduce the risk of a single individual having access to such broad information. But these reforms, like those implemented after the Ames case, could not fully address the fundamental vulnerability. A knowledgeable insider who understands security systems can often find ways to defeat them. Hanssen had passed polygraph examinations during his years of active espionage. He had undergone financial reviews without raising alarms. He had been investigated multiple times as part of broader efforts to identify the mole and had never been flagged as a primary suspect until the Russian file provided external evidence. The FBI's internal investigation into how Hanssen had remained undetected produced findings similar to those in the Ames case: a culture that emphasized trust among colleagues, systems that focused on external threats rather than internal ones, and a reluctance to believe that a fellow agent could be capable of such betrayal. The report acknowledged that multiple opportunities to detect Hanssen had been missed, that warning signs had been present but not recognized, and that the agency's counterintelligence capabilities, despite being among the most sophisticated in the world, had proven insufficient against a determined insider. One of the most troubling aspects of the Hanssen case was the role of Bonnie Hanssen's discovery in 1980. When Bonnie found the money and confronted Robert, when she insisted that he confess to a priest and stop his espionage, she had provided the FBI with an opportunity to prevent 2 decades of additional damage. But Father Bucciarelli, bound by the seal of confession, did not report Robert's activities to authorities, and Bonnie, trusting her husband's promise to stop, did not go to the FBI herself. The question of whether either of them had a moral or legal obligation to report Robert's espionage became a matter of intense debate after Hanssen's arrest. Catholic doctrine holds that the seal of confession is absolute, that a priest cannot under any circumstances disclose what is learned during the sacrament of reconciliation. Father Bucciarelli's decision not to report Hanssen was consistent with this doctrine, though critics have argued that spiritual obligations should not supersede the duty to prevent ongoing harm. Bonnie's decision not to report her husband was more complicated. She was not bound by the seal of confession, but she was bound by marriage, by trust in Robert's promises, and by a belief that he had genuinely repented. Whether she should have gone to the FBI in 1980 remains a question with no easy answer, complicated by the fact that doing so would have destroyed her family years earlier and would have required her to betray her husband to authorities. Robert Hanssen spent his final years in solitary confinement at ADX Florence, confined to a small cell for 23 hours per day, allowed minimal human contact. He maintained limited correspondence with family members, some of whom wrote to him occasionally, though the content of those letters has never been publicly disclosed. He reportedly spent his time reading, particularly religious texts, and reflecting on his life, though what conclusions he reached remain unknown. In interviews conducted before his death, Hanssen expressed regret in terms that were similar to those used by Aldrich Ames. Acknowledgement of the damage he had caused, coupled with rationalizations that sought to minimize his personal responsibility. He suggested that the information he had provided was not as damaging as prosecutors claimed, that many of the intelligence capabilities he had disclosed were probably already known to the Russians through other sources, and that the sources he had compromised had understood the risks when they agreed to work with American intelligence. This framing ignored the fundamental reality. Robert Hanssen had been entrusted with protecting American intelligence operations and the sources who made them possible. He had violated that trust for more than 20 years, had received over $1.4 million in exchange for information that led to arrests, executions, and the collapse of operations that had taken years to develop. The men whose names he sold to the KGB and SVR were not responsible for their own deaths, simply because they understood that espionage involved risk. They had been promised protection by the FBI, and that protection had been rendered meaningless by a man working in the organization that had made the promise. On June 5, 2023, Robert Hanssen died in his cell at ADX Florence. He was 79 years old. The cause of death was not immediately disclosed, though prison officials later confirmed that it appeared to be natural causes. News of his death received limited media coverage, a footnote in the ongoing history of American counterintelligence rather than a major event. Bonnie Hanssen, who had divorced Robert while he was in prison, issued no public statement. The children, most of whom had long since stopped discussing their father publicly, remained silent. The legacy of Robert Hanssen's espionage extends beyond the specific operations he compromised or the specific sources he betrayed. His case, combined with Aldrich Ames's nearly simultaneous espionage, demonstrated that American intelligence agencies faced a fundamental vulnerability: insider threats from individuals who understood the systems designed to protect classified information and who could exploit that knowledge to operate undetected for years or even decades. The question of what drives someone like Robert Hanssen to betray their country, their colleagues, and the sources they are entrusted to protect has no simple answer. Money was clearly a factor. Hanssen received significant sums and used them to relieve financial pressures. But money alone does not explain 20 years of sustained betrayal, particularly for someone who lived modestly and did not spend the money in ways that significantly improved his lifestyle. Ego and the desire for significance also played roles. Hanssen described his espionage as intellectually stimulating, a game he was winning against adversaries who did not know he existed. This suggests that the betrayal provided him with a sense of importance that his work at the FBI did not. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Hanssen's case is the apparent ease with which he compartmentalized his espionage from the rest of his life. He was capable of attending Mass on Sunday, of participating in family dinners, of presenting himself as a man of faith and principle, and then driving to a park to deliver classified documents to Russian intelligence without apparent psychological conflict. This capacity for compartmentalization suggests either profound self-deception or a moral framework so distorted that betrayal and religious devotion could coexist without contradiction. The families of those Hanssen betrayed, like the families affected by Aldrich Ames's espionage, bore consequences they did not choose and could not control. Boris Eugen's wife and children endured more than a decade of uncertainty, ostracism, and hardship while he was imprisoned in Russia. The families of Motorin and Martinov, already devastated by Ames's betrayal, were victims of Hanssen's independent decision to sell the same names. The CIA and FBI officers who had recruited these sources and promised to protect them carried the burden of knowing that their promises had been broken by someone working in their own agencies. The distribution of harm in espionage cases is profoundly unequal. Robert Hanssen made a choice to betray his country for money and ego. That choice led to executions, destroyed lives, collapsed operations, and institutional damage that persisted for decades. But Hanssen himself, while imprisoned for the remainder of his life, was never in physical danger. He was fed, clothed, housed, and allowed to live to an old age. The sources he betrayed had no such luxury. They were arrested, tortured, tried, and in some cases shot. Consequences that followed directly from Hanssen's decision but that he would never personally experience. This asymmetry raises questions about justice and accountability that have no satisfying answers. Hanssen pled guilty, was sentenced to life imprisonment, and died in prison. But no punishment could restore the lives he destroyed, could undo the operations he compromised, or could compensate the families who suffered because of his betrayal. And while his death in 2023 marked the end of his life, it did not mark the end of the consequences of his actions, which continue to shape intelligence operations, security protocols, and the lives of those he harmed. Robert Hanssen was 35 years old when he first approached Soviet intelligence in October 1979. He was 56 when he was arrested in February 2001. And he was 79 when he died in federal prison in June 2023, having spent more than 20 years betraying his country and more than 20 years imprisoned for that betrayal. There is no redemption in this story, no transformation that makes his choices comprehensible or acceptable. There is only the arithmetic of consequence. Lives destroyed, operations compromised, trust broken, and a legacy of damage that persists long after the man who caused it has died. And in the end, perhaps that is the most disturbing truth about the Robert Hanssen case. Not that someone capable of such sustained betrayal existed, but that the systems designed to detect and stop him proved so inadequate for so long, allowing ordinary selfishness and ego, given access and knowledge, to destroy lives on a scale that still resonates decades later.